Well, good evening, church history friends. My name is Barb Walden, and it's a joy to welcome you to the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation's Summer Series. This July, we are taking a virtual journey down the Restoration Trail, and tonight we get to explore the historic Plano Stone Church. I hope you all are as excited as I am. Now, our plan for the evening is for me to share briefly about the Plano period to help set the stage for our virtual tour. I'll then hand the spotlight over to Locke, and he'll lead us through a tour of the Plano Stone Church. There will be times during the tour to make comments and ask questions, and we encourage it. So feel free to use the chat feature to share your comments, but we ask that you use the Q&A feature when sending in your questions. We enjoy fielding those questions, and we don't want to lose them in the busyness and the wittiness of the chats. So, fun fact, the virtual tours we are sharing this July throughout the summer series would not be possible if it wasn't for the generous support of people like you. Your donations go a long way towards preserving the historic sites and developing awesome programs that help share the stories behind the historic sites. So like I say every week, any donations received during our summer series will go towards the ongoing maintenance and preservation of the Community of Christ historic sites. For those who like to make a donation, we welcome that, and you will find the donations link and mailing address in the chats. Thank you all for helping preserve church heritage. Now let's take a moment to dive into some Plano history. Now, last week, if you recall, we explored Nauvoo history, and we left off with David Hiram Smith writing a song about Emma and Joseph Smith III headed to Amboy in 1860. Well, after Joseph III was ordained prophet president of the reorganization, he returned home to Nauvoo, where church headquarters would remain until 1866. That's 6 years. Now, although Nauvoo is located on a beautiful curve of the Mississippi River, it was a pretty isolated spot in the 1860s for church headquarters. There was a pretty convincing argument during the time to move church headquarters from Nauvoo to Plano. A large portion of RLDS members and leaders were living in the area in the 1860s, with a number of congregations in Plano and around Plano, also in southern Wisconsin. There were more transportation opportunities in Plano. It was a railroad town that was ideal for missionaries traveling out and church members traveling into Plano to attend general conferences. Plano was also on the up and up, while Nauvoo's high times were unfortunately in the past for the most part. So Israel Rogers, who you see here, encouraged Joseph Smith III to move east to Plano. Rogers was a bishop in the church. He was appointed bishop at the Amboy 1860 conference, right along with Joseph Smith III. The difference is that Joseph Smith III was in attendance when he became president. Rogers wasn't at the Amboy conference when he was nominated and confirmed to be bishop of the church. So later general conferences would take place in Israel Rogers' barn, located not far from Plano, and you can see an image here of that barn. Perhaps this was Israel Rogers' way of keeping a closer eye on what happens at church conference. I would do that if I was nominated and confirmed to be bishop and I wasn't there. Well, Israel Rogers was pretty convincing, and the Smith family relocated to Plano in 1866. First moving into a home that was owned by the Rogers family, and later moving into a home of their own. So in addition to building the Plano Stone Church, the RLDS also established Herald printing press. This print shop churned out a lot of material for this young reorganization. We published a church newspaper in Plano, missionary materials, lots of missionary materials, and educational resources, even for the youth of the church, among many, many other things. Now, two people who arrive on the RLDS scene during this period are Marietta Walker and Mark Forscott. And for many of you who have attended the online lectures, you've heard a lot about Marietta Walker and Mark Forscott. These two were movers and shakers. Marietta was raised in the early church, of the 1830s and 40s, but her family's experience wasn't that great. And the early church wasn't one that brought back a lot of fond memories for them. So Marietta left the church as an adult and joined the Methodists. She married a Confederate soldier from Virginia and was living in Texas when she heard that her sister Emmeline and her mother joined the reorganization. Well, by this time, Marietta was widowed with a young daughter, and so she decided to relocate to Illinois. She traveled north in 1865 to be with her family in Illinois, but she had no intention of joining the Latter-day Saint group. When she arrived, she discovered her family was totally immersed in the local RLDS congregation. Her brother-in-law, Elijah Banta, was a local leader and a good friend of Israel Rogers and Joseph Smith III. So Marietta in her new community was surrounded by church members. And in many ways, these family relations, what probably softened her negativity towards the church. And eventually she joined the church. Once she joined the church, she was just on fire. And in Plano, she worked with Mark Forscutt as a copy editor on the 1867 Joseph Smith translation of the Bible, which is traditionally known as the inspired version. Joseph Smith III also roped her into taking a more active role at the Herald, where she wrote the Little Folks column. And in 1869, she started a church publication just for children that was called Zion's Hope. Marietta and her sister Emmeline also began the first RLDS women's organization called the Society of Gleaners. So she was active from, seems like the moment she came out of the water, she was working for the reorganization. Well, Mark Forscutt joined the reorganization in the 1860s, and he relocated to Plano not long after the Smith family. And he was just as energized and on fire as Marietta Walker. They would have worked together a lot. Forscutt served as an editor at the Herald. He worked, as I mentioned, on the new translation of the Bible with Marietta. Forscutt authored a number of hymns. He wrote music for even more hymns. He edited at least 2 church hymnals, and he partnered with Joseph Smith III in purchasing the Kirtland Temple, as well as traveled as a church minister around the United States and even outside of the United States, as far away as England and Tahiti. Mark Forscutt was such a good friend of the Smith family that he delivered the sermon for Emma Smith's funeral service in Nauvoo in the 1870s. So Plano is an important place in our church history. Plano is where Joseph III moves out of his father's shadow and begins to be seen as his own person and leader. RLDS identity takes shape during this time, and a clearer mission emerges during the Plano period. As Joseph and others gather the scattered saints, they, in many ways, form a clearer mission and message for the reorganization. It's also where Joseph III establishes his own approach to community, and that of encouraging church members to get along with their neighbors where they are, rather than gathering to a central location or build an exclusive church members only kind of community. So in some ways, Joseph III models how one can live in healthy shared community during this Plano period. And in Plano, a community was already established when he arrived in town. And so he actively began engaging with people in the community, getting to know them. And after some time had passed, he began taking on community leadership roles, serving as a trustee in the village, serving as president of the village board and justice of the peace. He becomes an active person in the Plano community. And I think my favorite role of his was when he served as captain of the Plano baseball team. So the headquarters was in Plano for about 15 years. And as church members began to turn their gaze towards Lamoni in 1881, the Plano community held a banquet for the Smith family as a token of appreciation. And Joseph received during that banquet an elegant gold-headed cane as a token of remembrance, while his wife Bertha received a silver cake basket from the community. And Joseph reflected on his experience in Plano in an 1881 Herald article. And in it, he said, "We went to Plano in 1866. The few saints there with whom we cast our lot were poor and roundly despised by many. and we were shunned as one whom the community were obliged to tolerate, but did not care to. But the saints won a place and a name, and we with them until our position was an assured one. And when the office and its employees left the town, there were universal expressions of regret among all classes. But the saddest parting was from the little band of believers still remaining at Plano, Elder Wentworth Vicary in charge. The saints are not demonstrative as a rule, yet the strong clasp of the hand, the starting tear, subdued voice, and quivering lips all told of the pleasant and long continued association, now broken, never to be renewed, unless under different skies and in remote places. We had fought the battle in its fury together. We had won a victory together, and the parting under the upraised banner was glorious, but sad, very sad. So that's a little Plano history as background in preparation for the main event, which is Lach's virtual tour. So Lach, I'll stop my screen share, and I hope that you'll tell us a little bit more about this historic house of worship in Plano.
I would love to. Just a thumbs up that we've got the Plano Stone Church on the screen now. I think we do. So I got to say that I am far from an expert on the Plano story, and I have loved getting more familiar with it just over the last few weeks. Before we go inside, I just want to note that Dalen Elliott, one of our young adults who spent several summers with us, was kind enough to put together this virtual tour as well as the others that we have been sharing. He is an extraordinarily talented young man, and he has been able to do that and through that process allow us to take the historic sites to members and friends around the world. Just 2 months ago, I got to share with 150 members on Tahiti some of these historic sites as we walked through together virtually because of Dalen's efforts. And Dalen has been able to do that because of the generous folks of his financial supporters of the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation. So your gifts are just extraordinarily appreciated and are allowing the foundation to do amazing things and helping young people like Dalen as he works his way through Graceland University. So I'm on the topic of fundraising and money, so let me stay there for a minute. I want to talk about fundraising for the Plano Stone Church. So the conference of 1866 asked the Plano branch to consider putting together a building that could also host general conference. There had been a branch at Fox River near where Bishop Rogers lived who were preparing to build a building. They had lumber purchased and were ready to go, but it kind of fell through. And so they agreed that they would provide the lumber if the funds could be generated to purchase the materials and the labor to finish the product. So that's what happened. The Henning brothers, two members, donated 2 town lots to build on. As we are preparing to launch the fundraising efforts, we make it clear that we plan to make the building available not just for our own use, but to others as well, with no restrictions to be made as to sect or association. We were always annoyed when others would refuse to allow our missionaries to use their meeting houses. And so we generally made a point of being very welcoming with the use of ours, even welcoming a local spiritualist, or at least we said we would if he ever wanted to. He asked if we would allow him to use it if needed. We said sure. He then planted 2 trees out front and donated $50 to the building fund. The local postmaster pledged $25. When Joseph III went to collect the pledge, the postmaster said, wait a minute, there's no steeple on that building. I'm not going to contribute unless there's a steeple. Joseph III pointed out to him it would be pretty silly to spend $1,500 for a steeple to collect his pledge of $25. So we passed on the $25. The total cost of the stone church, $6,750. Mr. Lewis Stewart, who was probably the most prominent citizen in Plano, If you visit Plano in person or you Google Lewis Stewart Plano online, you'll see a beautiful picture of his Italianate home, not far from the stone church. He ended up as one of the founders of what would become International Harvester. He also ran unsuccessfully for governor of Illinois, but successfully for US Congress and served for years. So Mr. Stewart was also instrumental in building what was called Academy Hall. And that is where we worshiped prior to the construction of the stone church. At some point, though, some of the local Methodists decide we shouldn't be allowed to use Academy Hall because we're Latter-day Saints. And they are creating significant difficulty for us. And the board of Academy Hall was preparing to vote to throw us out. Mr. Stewart, not one of us, not religious at all for that matter, Mr. Stewart went to the board of Academy Hall and explained that as one of the principal donors for that building, he took a special interest in how it was being used, and that if they threw us out, he would quickly return with an axe and take the building down. He was successful in diffusing the situation. They allowed us to continue worshiping in Academy Hall until we were able to build the Plano Stone Church. And Mr. Stewart offered to fund 10% of the construction costs. Remember, not a member. $6,750 is the cost. He saw that in our church publications and realized that he had only donated $300 or so, not the full 10%, and he wanted to pay up. But Joseph III said, no, sir, you're not one of us. You've been incredibly generous. Your help is very much appreciated, but we've had generous gifts from other people as well, and we've met the cost. And Stewart started to insist, no. Joseph III wouldn't take additional funds because the expense was covered. Stewart was stunned, and he noted that some other congregations in the city had not only happily accepted his full 10%, but had come back asking for more. And I think Joseph III thought that he appreciated that we were not in any way taking advantage of his generosity. A little on construction, I'll share a few quotes from Joseph Smith III from his memoirs. He said, "We contracted with a Mr. Post, who owned a quarry on Fox River, some 1.75 miles south and a little west of Plano, for 75 cords of stone." So the Fox River stone is the walls. Then Joseph III continues, "Brother John Earnshaw, a stone mason and contractor from England, gave us an estimate for the stonework of a building to be 40 by 60 feet with an 18-foot, 9-inch ceiling. Brother Levi Lightfoot, a carpenter and builder, did the same for the lumber work. The footing of the building was outlined with a smooth surfaced stone." So we're talking down here now. So basically the water table, that was often called. "Smooth surface stone obtained from Aurora, as also were the corners," meaning the coins in the corners, "the arched windows and the doorways." So two different quarries that they're getting the stone from. This would be Aurora, the rest of it Fox River. Let's step inside and see if we have a good look at this stone, which was above the doorway outside. So this is the original, which we replaced as part of some restoration work a number of years back. Here's what Joseph III said: "By some chance, Brother Wright, a painter who outlined the motto, reversed the in the phrase holiness to the Lord." So I don't know if you can see that reversed in, which oddity still stands carved in that enduring stone. And so, of course, when we redid this stone, had a new one carved, we also included that reversed in. Joseph III continues. So he says that they don't have enough money for the pew boxes. Well, maybe they should have gone back to Mr. Stewart, but they didn't. He said, we didn't have enough money to put pew boxes in. So brethren William and Edwin Crum, iron founders, came to the rescue with a proposition to furnish iron ends and centerpieces if we would get lumber for the seats and backs and be content with that style of construction. We were glad to accept their offer, and we had to pay them only the cost of material, for they donated their work. So the Crum brothers cast these metal pieces as well as the supports. Then the men of the congregation got together and crafted the benches. As all the men of the branch turned out to help make the seats, they were finished and painted. So they're not painted today. We probably should reconsider that at some point. And all the inside woodwork of the building also, in time for the conference of 1869. Let's have a closer look at the pulpit. This is a wonderful pulpit. It's the original, been there from the beginning. Let's see if we can step behind it. Okay, so you are now behind the Plano stone church pulpit, where every president of the reorganization has preached from. The only one missing, of course, from the early church, Joseph Smith Jr. This pulpit has special memories from me, some fond, some not so fond. Some of you might remember that in 2010, this Plano stone church pulpit was moved from the stone church to the conference chamber for World Conference as part of our celebration of the anniversary of the church. That was a very fond memory. We had, I think it was John Horner playing Joseph Smith III, greeting Steve Veazey. Now, at that point in time, Steve had not yet preached from the pulpit in Plano. So in order to secure permission to borrow it, we had to promise that he would go to the stone church and preach from the pulpit there, and he did after conference. My not so fond memory, though, is that I moved this, I think single-handedly, to Independence, and my back is still a little pained from that experience. A few important events, Barb touched on some of these, but a few important events in the life of the church during the Plano years. The Holy Scriptures were published for the first time in 1867. Mark Shearer has talked about missions to the European continent, starting from during the Plano years, to Australia. And of course, near and dear to my heart, those Australian missionaries, Claude Roger and Charles Wesley Wandell, got stuck in Tahiti for a little while. They found some of the native people. They ended up having a wonderful time with them and converting many. And it is, of course, why we have hundreds of French Polynesian members at conference with their beautiful singing, their beautiful music. So that mission happened during the Plano years. Larry Tyree has done some amazing work on the church seal, which you see a replica of the original church seal behind the Plano stone church pulpit. Larry notes that the church was incorporated on October 21 of 1872, and that we were required by Illinois law to create a seal, a corporate seal, to stamp official documents. So this is what you stamp on documents, not necessarily what was intended to be the visual symbol of the church, but that's of course what it would become. The design committee for the first church seal included Joseph Smith III, Jason Briggs, Elijah Banta. The design was accepted at the April 1874 General Conference, and this first design was in use for 45 years. A few design elements to notice, of course, the lion and the lamb and the child. We have, well, I'll come back to that. Also, peace underneath, the date of incorporation, 1872. I hadn't really noticed this before, but there are 3 continents. They're hard to see on this one. They might not even be there, but the original 3 continents under the 3 figures representing the church's presence in Europe, North America, and Australia. And one of my favorite features, a palm tree here, celebrating the success of the church that had just occurred in French Polynesia. It's kind of commonly understood that the lion and the lamb and the child illustration is based on the work of folk artist Edward Hicks. But I think Larry has pretty conclusively shown that that's not necessarily the case. His art was not widely available. It was very closely held early on. But certainly Hicks was influenced by an English artist named Richard Westall, and his art, which is very similar, the lion, the lamb, and the child, shows up in all kinds of publications, including Bibles from the period in the collections of the Community of Christ Library. So most likely we are influenced by Richard Westall's engravings of this scene versus Edward Hicks. Some other significant things that happened during this Plano time period, of course, the Kirtland Temple suit, which, as we've talked about before, turns out that that case was dismissed, but it was still very important for us from a public relations perspective. But I think you all know the Kirtland Temple suit was dismissed because we filed it wrong. It was also during this time that a number of missionaries begin heading to Utah. The Utah mission opens up. It's also tragically during this time, 1877, that David Hiram Smith, Joseph Smith III's brother, was committed in an asylum in Elgin, Illinois. David, of course, born after his father's death. David grew up to be an extraordinarily talented painter, wrote poetry and hymns, maybe our best missionary, but also very, very ill eventually. He is getting dangerous. His brothers are desperately trying to keep him in their homes, but they're not able to do that. I occasionally have people, and maybe I've talked about this before, but pitch ideas on maybe what was wrong with David. It seems like probably some schizophrenia, maybe bipolar, maybe some depression, but he also had physical symptoms at times, like fevers. They had a doctor track me down a number of years ago and pitched the idea that it might have been valley fever, which is a fungus in the soil endemic to the San Joaquin Valley in California. It's also a problem in Arizona, and untreated, it can lead to meningitis. I don't believe that this particular doctor, he was looking at the symptoms that David had. I don't know that he knew that David had been on a mission to Utah, had gone to California, had gone to the San Joaquin Valley, had talked about the farmers plowing their fields, and then becomes ill. So I've had to kind of rethink that. There maybe is something to that part as maybe an element of David's illness. Not all of it, I think, but an element of it. I am going to stop my screen share there and welcome questions for Barb as the Plano expert.
Not so fast. Well, we do have a few questions in the queue, and the first one comes from Benjamin Rousseau. He says, the stones from different quarries, do they have different colors? Does the building have a multi-layered look to the stonework?
Yeah, I do think that there's a little different color, and some is rough and some is dressed. So I guess it's possible that that's part of why they're different colors as well. But it does seem to be a different kind and use of the stone.
Well, Caleb Rogers asks, who built the Plano Church and when was it completed? Lach, any idea the names of those who helped physically build the Plano Stone Church?
So I think that a few of those folks who gave us prices are probably the ones that end up building. So let me run back. Here we go. John Earnshaw, a stonemason, had come from England. Levi Lightfoot, a carpenter. And I think it's done by 1869. Mark
Hensley asks, why did the Saints decide to relocate to Lamoni?
Why did they decide to relocate to Lamoni, Barb?
Well, that's a great question, Mark. I think a lot of their decision was theological. They were working their way back to independence, and they were trying to get as close as they could without causing any trouble. Lamoni was also a good location for farmland, and if I remember right, they got a good price on that farmland in southern Iowa. Well, our next question comes from Gerald Gordier, and he says, this may have been answered earlier. I got on a little late, but are there services held at the Plano Church today?
They are. There is a Plano congregation. They're like a lot of our congregations are getting a little older. And in the winter months, they meet in Rogers Hall, which is right next door to the Stone Church. So in order to make sure that the structural integrity of the Stone Church was maintained, decades ago, World Church purchased the Plano Stone Church. Now that's, I think many of you, maybe most of you know that World Church owns all the properties anyway, but they kind of made a special decision to purchase Plano Stone Church, even though they already owned it, so that the congregation would have the money to build Rogers Hall instead of putting an addition on the Stone Church. So it's a separate building right next door, and that is where they have like potlucks and Sunday school classes and things like that. So they're able to use the space. It's much more functional, but also maintain the integrity of the historic structure.
Well, we don't currently have any questions in the queue, but I got a question for you, Locke. When I think of the Plano Stone Church and the Plano Period, it seems like it's a time of great stories about building relationships and getting to know the people of the community and new people coming into the church and arriving in the area. What are some of your favorite stories from the Plano Period and the Plano congregation?
Let me ponder that for a minute, because I had a bunch of them in my head just before you asked that question. I think that one of them, I've got a number of them, but one of them is that Joseph III, before he moves to Plano, now they know he's coming, but he's not yet there. They invite him to preach the memorial sermon for Abraham Lincoln. And of course, there were memorial sermons and services all over the country. And in his memorial sermon, Joseph apparently said something like he believed that Abraham Lincoln was the most mourned man who ever lived. What do you think about that, Barb? Could that be accurate at that point in time?
I don't know.
Joseph III thought it was true, but some of the church members, some of the brethren took exception to that and said, I can't believe that you forgot about the Savior. You forgot about Jesus. Which Joseph III said, wait a minute, how many mourners were at the tomb? Not so many, just a handful. So I thought that was kind of funny. There's another one that Kristen said I shouldn't tell, but I think I can tell it in a politically correct way. I'll try. I did not realize that Elijah Banta had a slight speech impediment. He stuttered just slightly. And a new building was being built in Plano, and Elijah and Joseph III are walking by, and they ask the contractor what he's building. And this man was not very nice and making fun of Elijah's speech impediment. He said, well, I'm building a house for skunks and stutterers. And without missing a beat, Elijah said, oh, well, so you and I will be roommates. I thought that was kind of funny. Let me know if I shouldn't have told that story, or if it was in any way offensive. I deeply apologize.
What about the story of the potatoes and Alexander Hale Smith?
So tell me that story.
No, this is your story, and I don't remember the details. But if you recall, Alexander was out on a missionary assignment, and his family didn't have much to put on the table, and
they're starving. Yeah, I think he might be in Utah, and they are in desperate straits. And I thought of that when I didn't want to tell it, because I forgot the Norwegian pronunciation. They're from the mission branch. Is it Hugas? The Hugas family. So Alexander's family is in desperate straits, and they just don't know what they're going to do. And suddenly a wagon pulls up, and it's full of food. And Brother Hugas gets out with some help, and they start unloading it. And he explains that he had a vision or an impression that Brother Smith's family was in trouble, needed help, and he felt compelled to gather up all this food and drive the wagon. And it was not, I don't think it's too close, it's a number of miles to bring relief. And he made sure that the family knew that if they ran low on anything, he would be there again, just to let him know. And it's one of Alexander's children, I think, who was telling it, and they were just extraordinarily touched by that story. Wonderful story of generosity.
Well, these are all great stories. We still don't have any questions in the queue, so I think it's fair to say that this is the fastest virtual tour we have given so far in the summer series. So congratulations, Lach. You have achieved the fastest virtual tour on record.
Well, it is one room. Looks like one question popped into the Q&A. Do you want to cover that one before we go?
Yeah. Kimberly Donarski asks, why would the church seal list 1872 instead of 1860? The church must have existed in 1865 for the Lincoln Memorial.
So the church existed, but it was not yet incorporated. So that was jumping through the legal hoops to incorporate the organization. And then the next version of the seal was done when we were in Iowa. And so we had to reincorporate in Iowa. So the next version said something like 1872, 1891, I think the date is. So it's just the date of the jumping through the legal hoops to incorporate as an organization.
Well, thank you for sharing with us, Lach. After tonight, we can all say that we have toured the Plano Stone Church. And friends, if you're interested in learning more about the Plano Stone Church and the Plano Period, we have all sorts of books and lectures for you to consider. Let me do a quick screen share. We can talk about some of those books. Unfortunately, there isn't one book that focuses exclusively on Plano history. But you can catch a lot of Plano history from the two books you see on the screen. Mark Shear's Volume 2, The Journey of a People, is a great resource for learning about the Plano period and the significant movers and shakers during this period. In addition, Joseph Smith III's memoirs, which are edited by Richard P. Howard, is a fantastic source for the Plano period and lots of Plano stories. Joseph Smith III was a great storyteller, and his memoirs are full of fantastic tales and a few lessons along the way. In addition, if you're interested in learning about the people of the Plano period, two biographies come immediately to mind. Roger Lanius's biography of Joseph Smith III is great. It dives into not only Joseph III's story, but also a lot of information about missionary expansion and establishing the reorganization during this historic Plano period. In addition, Valine Tippett's Avery, her biography on David Hiram Smith, explores David's role in the early reorganization and his role as a missionary and church leader during this period in Plano. It also looks at his struggle with mental illness and the heartbreaking decision by the Smith family during the Plano period to move David to the Northern Illinois Hospital and Asylum for the Insane in 1877. Locke talked about that earlier tonight. That hospital was in Elgin, which was only about 40 miles away from Plano. And so Valine Tippett's Avery's biography will go into a lot of these details. It's a fascinating read. We also have a number of recorded lectures on Plano and Plano people and topics that can be reached on the Historic Sites Foundation's website. Eric Paul Rogers presented a great lecture on Mark Hill Forscott earlier this year in the spring lecture series. You can find that on the website. There's also a lecture on Marietta Walker's story that's available. And Andrew Bolton shared an evening with us talking in great detail about the story behind the church seal and the many variations of the design that have taken place over the years, as well as around the world. It's a fantastic lecture. So if you want to learn more about Plano, there's plenty of resources to check out. I'm also thrilled to share that we are having so much fun talking church history in the summer series that we're expanding the series an extra week. We're adding a bonus program for all to enjoy on Wednesday, August 3rd. And the new program will feature our very own Lachlan Mackay exploring the newly discovered 1840s daguerreotype. So mark your calendars for Wednesday, August 3rd to hear all about the latest research being done by Lachlan Mackay and our friend Ron Romick. So to register for this program, head on over to the Summer Series webpage where you can sign up for that Wednesday, August 3rd program. It's called Hidden Things Shall Come to Light, the visual image of Joseph Smith Jr. And with that, we'll bring our evening program to a close. Thank you, Locke, for the virtual tour of the Plano Stone Church and for all of your research. And thank you to our friends in the audience for attending tonight, sharing the evening with us. We hope you will join us next week when we travel to Lamoni, Iowa to see Joseph Smith III's Liberty Hall. If you haven't already registered for next week's program, be sure to do so on our website. I'm dropping a link in right now to where you can register. So thanks again keep reading your church history, and we'll see you next week to share a few tales about Liberty Hall. Have a good night, everyone.